In a peaceful suburban neighborhood where houses were neatly lined up and lawns were trimmed to perfection, there was always an undercurrent of tension. This tension wasn't because of noisy neighbors or stray dogs running loose. It came from the Homeowners Association, or HOA for short. The HOA was supposed to keep things orderly, making sure everyone followed the rules so the community looked picture perfect. But not everyone agreed with how strictly these rules were enforced. At the heart of this enforcement was Carl, a man in his late 40s who took his job as an HOA officer very seriously. Some might say, too seriously. Every day, Carl would walk through the streets with a clipboard tucked under his arm, squinting at hedges that were maybe half an inch taller than allowed, or shaking his head at flower pots placed too close to driveways. He had earned himself a reputation for being relentless, often handing out fines for minor infractions like holiday lights left up after January 15th, or garage doors left open for more than 2 hours. To Carl, every rule mattered, no matter how small. The residents of the neighborhood had mixed feelings about him. Some appreciated his dedication to maintaining order, while others rolled their eyes whenever they saw him coming. Among those who weren't exactly fans of Carl's strictness was Mr. Thompson, a retired engineer who lived at the far end of Elm Street. Everyone called him Grandpa, even though he wasn't related to most of them. Grandpa Thompson was well-liked by almost everyone because of his quirky personality and inventive spirit. His front yard was unlike any other in the area. It was filled with odd yet fascinating creations. There was a windmill made entirely out of old bicycle parts, spinning lazily in the breeze. A fountain powered by solar panels bubbled cheerfully near the sidewalk. Colorful wildflowers spilled over the edges of planters, creating a vibrant contrast against the uniformity of the rest of the street. Inside his garage-turned-workshop, shelves groaned under the weight of tools, wires, gears, and half-finished projects. Grandpa loved tinkering with gadgets, building contraptions that solved problems no one else realized existed. But none of this sat well with Carl. To him, Grandpa's creative flair was nothing more than chaos disguised as charm. The mismatched decorations an eyesore, the homemade inventions, potential hazards, and the plants spilling onto the sidewalk, absolutely unacceptable. So naturally, Carl paid frequent visits to Grandpa's house, clipboard in hand, ready to document every single violation. One sunny afternoon, Carl decided it was time to address what he considered the biggest issue yet: Grandpa's fence. According to the HOA guidelines, backyard fences couldn't be taller than 6 feet unless special permission was granted, and Grandpa's fence was definitely taller. It stood proudly at about 8 feet, crafted from sturdy wooden planks painted a cheerful shade of white. Carl marched up to the property, fully intending to inspect it and issue yet another warning. However, when he reached the gate, he found it locked. This wasn't unusual. Grandpa often kept his backyard private. What was unusual was Carl's reaction. Instead of simply noting the locked gate on his clipboard and moving on, Carl felt a surge of frustration. He'd been dealing with Grandpa's eccentricities for months now, and each time it seemed like the older man was deliberately pushing boundaries. Today, Carl decided, enough was enough. If Grandpa wouldn't cooperate, then Carl would take matters into his own hands. Without giving it much thought, Carl grabbed hold of the top of the fence and hoisted himself up. It wasn't particularly difficult. He was in decent shape for his age. But as he swung his leg over the edge and prepared to drop down on the other side, something unexpected happened. A loud buzzing noise filled the air, followed by a sharp, tingling sensation that shot through Carl's body. Startled, he lost his balance and tumbled awkwardly onto the grass below. For a moment, Carl lay there, dazed and confused. His heart raced, and his muscles twitched involuntarily. What on earth had just happened? As he slowly sat up, still feeling the lingering effects of whatever had zapped him, he noticed a small metal box attached to the fence post nearby. Its indicator light blinked red almost mockingly. That's when he heard a chuckle from behind him. "Well, good morning, Carl," came a familiar voice. Carl turned to see Grandpa Thompson standing on his back porch, holding a glass of lemonade, and wearing an amused expression. "I hope you enjoyed my little welcome mat." Carl stared at him wide-eyed. What was that?" he stammered, pointing accusingly at the fence. Grandpa grinned wider. Oh, that? Just a little project I've been working on. Call it my Zap fence. Keeps unwanted visitors out. You're the first volunteer tester, actually. How'd it feel? Carl scrambled to his feet, brushing dirt off his pants, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. You electrified your fence? Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? Grandpa waved a dismissive hand. Relax, it's not dangerous. Well, not too dangerous anyway. It gives a nice jolt, but nothing that'll hurt anyone permanently. Mostly just surprises people. Like you. Despite his irritation, Carl couldn't help but glance around the backyard. It was as eclectic as the front yard, if not more so. There were piles of scrap metal stacked neatly in one corner, a weathered picnic table covered in blueprints, and a row of potted herbs lining the edge of the garden. In the far corner stood a small shed that looked like it doubled as a workshop. Tools hung on pegboards and shelves overflowed with odds and ends. On one shelf, Carl spotted a piece of paper labeled Project Zap Fence, Phase 2. Whatever Grandpa was planning next, it probably involved even more electricity. You can't do this, Carl insisted, trying to regain some authority. This violates HOA regulations. To his surprise, Grandpa laughed. Funny thing about those rules, they don't specifically mention electrified fences. I checked. Looks like I'm in the clear. Carl opened his mouth to argue further, but stopped himself. Something about the situation felt off. For one, he hadn't technically been invited onto the property, which meant climbing the fence could be seen as trespassing. And second, despite his indignation, he couldn't deny that Granby had a point. Maybe the rules didn't account for everything, or maybe they were too rigid to begin with. As Carl stood there torn between outrage and curiosity, he realized this incident might have bigger implications than he'd initially thought. Little did he know, it was only the beginning of a chain reaction that would ripple through the entire neighborhood and force him to reconsider what really mattered in a community. After the initial shock of the electrified fence wore off, Carl found himself sitting awkwardly on the grass, still tingling from the jolt. His pride was hurt almost as much as his backside, and he couldn't decide whether to feel angry, embarrassed, or both. Meanwhile, Grandpa Thompson leaned casually against the railing of his back porch, sipping his lemonade with an expression that hovered somewhere between amusement and satisfaction. Well, Grandpa said finally, breaking the silence, I suppose I should explain myself before you start thinking I'm some kind of mad scientist. He chuckled softly, setting his glass down on the porch railing. But first, are you okay? That zap wasn't too bad, was it? Carl glared up at him but didn't respond right away. Instead, he brushed more dirt off his pants and straightened his shirt, trying to regain some semblance of dignity. When he finally spoke, his tone was clipped. What exactly is the point of this contraption? He asked, gesturing vaguely toward the fence. You can't just go around shocking people. Grandpa raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by Carl's indignation. Oh, I don't shock just anyone, he replied calmly. Only those who decide to climb over my fence without permission. See, that's the thing about fences. They're there for a reason. Privacy, safety, keeping nosy folks out. No basic human needs. Carl bristled at the implication. I wasn't being nosy. I'm here on official HOA business. Your fence is too tall and I needed to inspect it. If you'd simply unlock the gate. But that's where we differ, Grandpa interrupted, folding his arms across his chest. You see, Carl, not everything in life is about following rules blindly. Sometimes you need to think about why those rules exist and whether they apply to every situation. My fence might be taller than what your precious HOA allows, but it serves a purpose. And if someone disrespects my property by climbing over it, well, he shrugged nonchalantly. Let's just say they get a little reminder. Carl opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. There was something infuriatingly logical about what Grandpa was saying, even if Carl didn't want to admit it. Still, he wasn't about to let the older man have the last word. Even if your intentions are understandable, he said stiffly, this kind of setup could be dangerous. What if a child climbed the fence? Or a pet? Someone could get seriously Hurt. Grandpa tilted his head thoughtfully, considering the question. Then he walked over to the metal box attached to the fence post and tapped it gently. Good concern, Carl, but unnecessary worry. This system isn't designed to harm, it's meant to deter. The voltage is low enough that it won't cause lasting damage, just a good scare. Enough to make someone think twice before trespassing again. Plus, he paused, grinning mischievously. It's not like kids or pets are likely to scale an 8-foot fence anyway. Carl frowned, unsure how to counter that argument. He glanced around the backyard again, taking in the cluttered yet oddly charming space. Tools hung neatly on pegboards inside the workshop shed, and piles of scrap metal were organized into stacks rather than scattered randomly. Even the garden had a certain charm, with herbs growing in mismatched pots and colorful wind chimes swaying gently in the breeze. It was clear that Grandpa put a lot of thought into his projects and maybe even his fence. You know, Grandpa continued, leaning against the shed doorframe, this whole thing started because I value my privacy. I've got tools and equipment back here worth thousands of dollars. Not to mention prototypes I've been working on for years. Can't risk someone wandering in and messing them up. Or worse, stealing them. Carl crossed his arms, feeling torn between frustration and curiosity. On one hand, he still believed Grandpa's actions violated the spirit of the HOA guidelines. On the other hand, he couldn't deny that the man had valid reasons for wanting to protect his property. So you decided to wire the fence yourself? He asked skeptically. Isn't that risky? What if something goes wrong? Grandpa laughed heartily at that. Risky? Son, I've been building things since before you were born. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. This fence has fail-safes built in. If the power gets too high, it automatically shuts off, and I check it regularly to make sure everything's running smoothly. Safer than leaving it unprotected, if you ask me. Despite himself, Carl felt a flicker of admiration for Grandpa's ingenuity. The man wasn't just tinkering aimlessly. He was solving real-world problems in creative ways. Still, admiration wasn't going to change the fact that Carl's job was to enforce the rules no matter how inconvenient they might seem. Look, he said firmly, even if your fence is safe, and I'm not saying it is, you're still breaking HOA regulations. Rules are rules. Grandpa sighed dramatically, shaking his head. Rules, rules, rules. Always with the rules. Carl, tell me something. Do you ever stop to think about why those rules exist? Or do you just follow them because someone told you to? The question caught Carl off guard. He hesitated, searching for the right words. Of course I think about it, he said eventually. The rules are there to maintain order, to keep things fair and consistent for everyone. And what happens when the rules stop making sense? Grandpa pressed, his voice calm but firm. When they become more about control than common sense? Do you follow them then too? Carl shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. He prided himself on being fair and impartial, but deep down, he knew there were times when the HOA's strict enforcement felt excessive, like fining Mrs. Harper for planting sunflowers along her driveway, or issuing warnings to Mr. Patel for leaving his garage door open during the day. Were those really issues worth pursuing? Or were they just distractions from bigger problems? Before Carl could come up with a satisfactory answer, Grandpa clapped his hands together briskly. Well, I'll tell you what. Since you're already here, why don't I show you around? Might give you a better understanding of why I built this fence and why I take such care to protect what's mine. Reluctantly, Carl nodded. Part of him wanted to leave immediately, to avoid any further embarrassment or awkwardness. But another part, the curious part, was intrigued. Maybe seeing the backyard up close would help him understand Grandpa's perspective. And who knows? Maybe it would even give him ideas for how to approach similar situations in the future. As they walked through the yard, Grandpa pointed out various inventions and explained their purposes. There was the solar-powered fountain, which doubled as a bird bath. A homemade weather station perched on top of the shed, tracking temperature and rainfall. And tucked away in a corner was a small greenhouse filled with exotic plants Grandpa had been cultivating for years. Each project had its own story, its own problem-solving twist that made Carl pause and reconsider his assumptions. By the time they returned to the porch, Carl's attitude had softened considerably. He still believed Grandpa's fence pushed the boundaries of acceptability, but he also understood the reasoning behind it. More importantly, he realized that enforcing rules wasn't always black and white. Sometimes it required listening, compromise, and a willingness to see things from another person's point of view. As they parted ways, with Carl promising to revisit the issue later, both men felt a subtle shift in their relationship. For Carl, it was a newfound appreciation for creativity and individuality. For Grandpa, it was satisfaction in knowing he'd planted a seed of doubt in the HOA officer's mind. Whether that seed would grow into meaningful change remained to be seen, but for now, both men walked away feeling just a little wiser than before. The next morning, news of Carl's electrifying encounter with Grandpa Thompson's fence spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. It started innocently enough. A few neighbors chatting over coffee about how they'd seen Carl storming out of Grandpa's yard looking flustered. By lunchtime, the story had grown legs, with details becoming more colorful and exaggerated as it passed from one person to another. By dinner, nearly everyone on Elm Street knew what had happened, and they couldn't stop talking about it. At first, reactions were mixed. Some residents found the whole thing hilarious. Kids giggled at the idea of the strict HOA officer getting zapped, and several parents admitted privately that Carl deserved a taste of his own medicine after all the fines he'd handed out over trivial matters. One teenager even drew a cartoon of Carl jumping the fence, complete with lightning bolts shooting out of the wooden planks, and posted it online. Within hours, it went viral among the younger crowd in the neighborhood. Others, however, weren't so amused. A handful of homeowners worried that an electrified fence might pose a real danger, especially to children or pets who might not realize the risks. Mrs. Patel, whose golden retriever often wandered near fences during walks, voiced her concerns at the local grocery store. "It's clever, sure," she said, adjusting her glasses, "but what if something goes wrong? What if someone gets hurt?" Meanwhile, Mr. Harper, whose wife had once been fined for planting sunflowers too close to their driveway, took a different stance. If Carl hadn't jumped the fence uninvited, none of this would have happened, he argued passionately while watering his lawn. Maybe people should focus less on punishing creativity and more on respecting boundaries. As opinions clashed, tensions began to simmer. The incident became the hot topic of conversation everywhere, from backyard barbecues to yoga classes at the community center. And when word reached the HOA board members, they decided it was time to address the growing controversy head-on. They scheduled an emergency meeting for the following week, inviting both Carl and Mr. Thompson to present their sides of the story. When the day of the meeting arrived, the community center was packed. Residents filled every seat, spilling into the aisles and standing along the walls. The air buzzed with anticipation as Carl stood at the front of the room, clutching his clipboard tightly. He looked nervous but determined, ready to defend his position against Grandpa's unconventional methods. Grandpa, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. He walked in wearing his usual faded flannel shirt and jeans, carrying a toolbox under one arm. As he settled into a chair near the podium, he greeted everyone with a warm smile, nodding politely to familiar faces. His calm demeanor only added fuel to the fire, making Carl feel even more uneasy. The meeting began with Carl presenting his case. Standing stiffly behind the podium, he laid out the facts in his usual meticulous manner. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, clearing his throat, "as you know, our neighborhood prides itself on maintaining high standards of safety and aesthetics. These standards are outlined in the HOA guidelines, which we all agreed to follow when we moved here. One such guideline states that backyard fences cannot exceed 6 feet in height without prior approval." He paused dramatically, glancing around the room to gauge reactions. When no one interrupted, he continued, "Mr. Thompson's fence is 8 feet tall, violating this rule. Furthermore, he has installed an unauthorized electrical system designed to deliver shocks to anyone attempting to cross it. While I understand his desire for privacy, this modification poses potential risks to residents and visitors alike. It is my duty to ensure compliance with these regulations, and therefore, I recommend taking appropriate action." Carl finished, his speech with a firm nod, stepping back to allow others to speak. Several board members exchanged glances, clearly weighing his arguments. Then, without waiting to be called upon, Grandpa stood up, holding up a hand. "Before y'all start deciding anything," he said cheerfully, "let me show you something." From his toolbox, he pulled out a small device resembling a remote control. Pressing a button, he activated a projector mounted discreetly in the corner of the room. On the wall appeared a slideshow of images, blueprints, diagrams, and photos of his electrified fence system. "This isn't some haphazard setup I threw together overnight," Grandpa explained, pointing to one slide. "Every component is carefully designed and tested. The voltage is low enough to deter trespassers without causing harm. There are fail-safes built in. If the current exceeds safe levels, the system automatically shuts down. And I perform regular maintenance checks to ensure everything runs smoothly." He clicked to the next image, showing a close-up of the metal box attached to the fence post. "See this indicator light? It tells me if the system's active. If anyone tries to tamper with it, it disables itself immediately. This isn't about hurting people, it's about protecting my property. Tools, prototypes, personal belongings. They're valuable to me, and I have every right to safeguard them." Grandpa paused, letting his words sink in. Then he gestured toward the audience. "Now, I'll admit, maybe wiring the fence wasn't the most conventional choice. But ask yourselves, why do we have rules in the first place? To keep things orderly, yes, but also to protect each other's rights. My fence does exactly that. It keeps unwanted visitors out while ensuring my family and neighbors stay safe." His tone softened as he concluded. "I'm not asking for special treatment. All I want is for folks to consider whether enforcing every rule blindly serves the greater good. Maybe sometimes flexibility makes more sense than rigidity." The room erupted into murmurs as residents debated his points. Some nodded in agreement, impressed by Grandpa's thoughtful approach. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether his invention truly aligned with HOA standards. Board members scribbled notes furiously, trying to make sense of the conflicting opinions. Finally, Mrs. Allen, the HOA president, called for order. Leaning into the microphone, she addressed the crowd. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson, for sharing your perspective. And thank you, Carl, for bringing this matter to our attention. Clearly, this is a complex issue that requires careful consideration. In light of today's discussion, the board will take some time to review the situation and consult legal experts regarding the fence's compliance with safety regulations. Until then, we'll table any formal action." Her announcement drew a mix of cheers and groans, but ultimately, it signaled a temporary truce. For now, Grandpa could keep his electrified fence, though the HOA reserved the right to revisit the issue later. As the meeting adjourned, residents lingered, continuing the debate in smaller groups. Outside the community center, Carl approached Grandpa hesitantly. "Look," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I still think your fence pushes the limits, but I see where you're coming from. Maybe there's room for compromise." Grandpa smiled knowingly. "Compromise sounds good to me, Carl. Just remember, rules are tools, not chains. Use them wisely." With that, the two men parted ways, leaving behind a neighborhood buzzing with renewed energy. Whether it led to lasting change or simply faded into the background remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. Grandpa's electrified fence had sparked a conversation that wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. In the days following the HOA meeting, the neighborhood buzzed with activity, not just from people talking about Grandpa Thompson's electrified fence, but also from subtle shifts in how residents interacted with one another. The incident had stirred up more than just opinions. It had unearthed deeper questions about community values, individuality, and the balance between rules and freedom. Carl, who usually prided himself on being unflappable, found himself struggling to shake off the embarrassment of the whole ordeal. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him, some sympathetic, others gleeful. Kids giggled as they passed him on their bikes, whispering behind cupped hands. Even adults couldn't resist teasing him lightly. At the local coffee shop, Mr. Harper slapped him on the back and joked, "Next time you're inspecting fences, maybe bring a ladder instead." Carl forced a laugh, though his cheeks burned red. But it wasn't just the jokes that bothered him. It was the way people were starting to look at him differently, as if they no longer saw him as someone working for the good of the community, but rather as a rigid enforcer who cared more about rules than relationships. This realization gnawed at him, especially during quiet moments when he sat alone at home, staring at his clipboard and wondering whether he'd lost sight of what truly mattered. Meanwhile, Grandpa Thompson became something of a local celebrity. Neighbors stopped by his house more often, curious to see the infamous fence up close or to chat about his latest inventions. Some even brought gifts, a plate of cookies here, a potted plant there, as tokens of appreciation for standing up to the HOA. Grandpa welcomed everyone warmly, offering lemonade and stories about his projects. He seemed unfazed by the attention, treating it all with his characteristic humor and humility. One afternoon, as Carl walked past Grandpa's house, he noticed a small crowd gathered near the fence. They were laughing and pointing at a new addition, a hand-painted sign nailed to the gate that read, "Beware, high-voltage ego trap." Carl groaned inwardly, knowing full well it was directed at him. Still, he couldn't help but chuckle. It was clever after all. As the weeks went by, the neighborhood dynamic continued to evolve. Conversations at block parties and school pickup lines revolved around broader topics now, like how to strike, a better balance between enforcing guidelines and allowing creative expression. Inspired by Grandpa's ingenuity, some residents began experimenting with their own quirky touches. Mrs. Patel added colorful wind chimes to her porch railing. The Garcias painted a mural on their garage door depicting scenes from nature. Slowly but surely, the once uniform streetscape started to reflect the personalities of those who lived there. Even within the HOA board, attitudes began to shift. Board members, influenced by the lively discussions at the emergency meeting, decided to revisit certain policies that had long been considered non-negotiable. For instance, they loosened restrictions on holiday decorations, allowing residents to keep them up until February 1st instead of January 15th. They also introduced a suggestion box where neighbors could propose ideas for improving the community, without fear of immediate rejection. Despite these positive changes, not everyone was happy. A small group of homeowners remained staunchly opposed to any deviation from the original HOA guidelines. Led by Mrs. Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher known for her love of order, they argued that relaxing rules would lead to chaos. "If we start bending every rule because someone thinks it's creative or necessary," she declared at a subsequent board meeting, "we'll lose the very thing that makes this neighborhood special." Her concerns weren't entirely dismissed. The board acknowledged the importance of maintaining standards while emphasizing the need for flexibility. To address these tensions, they organized a series of workshops aimed at fostering dialogue between residents. The goal was simple: encourage everyone to share their perspectives and find common ground. At one such workshop, Carl found himself sitting across from Grandpa Thompson. It was an awkward moment at first, both men unsure how to break the ice. Finally, Carl cleared his throat and said, "So, I hear your fence has become quite the tourist attraction." Grandpa grinned, leaning back in his chair. "Well, I can't take all the credit. Seems like folks enjoy a bit of drama now and then." Carl chuckled nervously, then hesitated before adding, "I guess I owe you an apology. I may have been too quick to judge your methods." To his surprise, Grandpa waved a dismissive hand. "No harm done, Carl. We all make mistakes. Besides, you gave me a chance to show off my work. Can't complain about that." Their conversation grew easier after that, shifting from apologies to shared experiences. Carl learned more about Grandpa's background, how he'd worked as an engineer, for decades designing systems that solved real-world problems. In turn, Grandpa listened intently as Carl explained why he'd become so passionate about enforcing HOA rules, revealing insecurities Carl rarely admitted to anyone else. By the end of the workshop, both men left feeling lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. They weren't exactly friends yet, but they'd taken the first step toward mutual understanding, and that was progress. Back at home, Carl spent hours reflecting on everything he'd heard over the past few weeks. He realized that his job wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about nurturing a sense of belonging among residents. Rules were important, yes, but so was empathy. If he wanted to earn back the trust of the community, he needed to approach his role differently. With this newfound perspective, Carl made a conscious effort to connect with neighbors on a personal level. Instead of marching up driveways with a clipboard, he started greeting people by name, asking how their day was going. When issues arose, he sought compromise rather than confrontation, and while he still believed in the value of structure, he began advocating for policies that allowed room for individuality. For Grandpa Thompson, life returned to its usual rhythm, but with a twist. His electrified fence remained intact, serving as both a practical deterrent and a symbol of resilience. Occasionally, he'd tweak the system, adding new features like motion-activated lights or a low hum that sounded whenever someone approached. These updates sparked fresh waves of curiosity, drawing visitors eager to learn about his latest innovations. Through it all, the neighborhood thrived, not despite its quirks, but because of them. Residents embraced their differences, finding joy in the unique contributions each person brought to the table. Block parties grew livelier, gardens more vibrant, and friendships stronger. Even the HOA meetings, once dreaded by many, became opportunities for collaboration rather than conflict, and as for Carl, he never forgot the lesson he'd learned that sunny afternoon when he jumped Grandpa's fence. Sometimes boundaries exist not to divide, but to remind us to respect one another's space and creativity. Whether intentional or not, Grandpa's electrified fence had delivered far more than just a jolt of electricity. It had sparked a transformation that rippled through the entire community, leaving everyone a little wiser, a little kinder, and a lot closer than before. As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, one that felt more harmonious and connected than ever before. The electrified fence incident had become something of a legend, a story told with equal parts humor and admiration. For Carl, it marked the beginning of a profound personal transformation. He no longer saw himself as merely an enforcer of rules, but as a facilitator of community spirit. His clipboard, once a symbol of authority, now served as a tool for collaboration. Carl's newfound approach was evident in how he interacted with residents. Instead of showing up unannounced to issue warnings, he made a point to engage with people on their terms. If someone's lawn needed attention, he'd offer helpful tips instead of handing out fines. When Mrs. Harper planted her beloved sunflowers, again, this time slightly closer to the driveway, Carl didn't bat an eye. In fact, he complimented her on how vibrant they looked, and even suggested she enter them in the local gardening contest. Word of his change in attitude spread quickly, earning him a reputation not as a strict disciplinarian but as a thoughtful neighbor who genuinely cared about the well-being of the community. People began inviting him to barbecues and holiday gatherings, events he'd always skipped in the past. At first, Carl felt out of place, unsure how to navigate these social settings. But over time, he grew comfortable, laughing along with jokes and sharing stories of his own. It wasn't long before he realized that building relationships was far more rewarding than enforcing regulations. Grandpa Thompson, meanwhile, continued to tinker away in his workshop, coming up with new inventions that delighted and amazed his neighbors. His backyard became a sort of open-air gallery where curious visitors could marvel at his creations. There was the smart bird feeder that played recorded bird calls to attract different species, and the solar-powered lanterns that lit up pathways during evening strolls. Each project was quirky yet functional, embodying Grandpa's philosophy of solving everyday problems with creativity and ingenuity. But perhaps his most talked-about invention was Phase 2 of the Zap fence. True to form, Grandpa hadn't stopped at simply deterring trespassers. He'd added a feature that announced any unauthorized entry with a cheerful voice recording. "Welcome to Grandpa's yard," the speaker would chirp, followed by a polite reminder, "Please use the gate next time." While some found it amusing, others appreciated the light-hearted touch. It was hard to stay mad when you were greeted with such whimsy. The fence itself remained a topic of conversation, though the tone had shifted significantly. What had once been divisive now served as a reminder of the importance of respecting boundaries, in both literal and figurative senses. Neighbors joked about it affectionately, referring to it as Grandpa's electric welcome mat. Even Mrs. Jenkins, who had initially opposed the idea, admitted privately that she admired its effectiveness. "If only my teenage grandson thought twice before climbing fences," she quipped during a book club meeting, drawing laughter from the group. For Carl, the fence represented something deeper, a turning point in his understanding of balance. He came to see that rules weren't meant to stifle individuality, but to create a framework within which everyone could thrive. By allowing room for creativity and personal expression, the neighborhood had become richer and more vibrant. And while he still believed in the value of structure, he now recognized that flexibility was just as important. One crisp autumn morning, Carl decided to pay Grandpa a visit, not to inspect anything or discuss regulations, but simply to chat. As he approached the house, he noticed Grandpa sitting on the porch, tinkering with a small gadget. "Morning, Carl," Grandpa called out, waving him over. "What brings you by today?" Carl hesitated for a moment, then took a seat on the steps beside him. "Just wanted to check in," he said, offering a sheepish smile. "See how things are going," Grandpa chuckled, setting the gadget aside. "Things are good, I reckon. Fences working fine, workshop stocked, and the garden's thriving. Can't complain." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching leaves drift lazily to the ground. Finally, Carl spoke up. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about that day. The fence, the zap, everything. I guess I deserved it, didn't I?" Grandpa tilted his head, considering the question. "Maybe," he replied with a twinkle in his eye. "Or maybe it was just a nudge to think differently. Either way, lesson learned, right?" Carl nodded slowly, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. "Yeah, I think so. You taught me something important that day. Rules are tools, like you said, not chains. They're there to guide us, not control us." Grandpa patted him on the shoulder, his expression warm. "Glad to hear it, son. Sometimes all it takes is a little shock to wake us up." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, upcoming holidays, neighborhood projects, and even plans for a winter carnival. As they talked, Carl realized how much he enjoyed spending time with Grandpa. Despite their differences, they shared a mutual respect and appreciation for each other's perspectives. It was a friendship neither had anticipated, but both valued deeply. By the end of the year, the neighborhood had transformed in subtle yet meaningful ways. Block parties were more inclusive, with everyone encouraged to contribute whatever talents or ideas they had. Creative touches popped up everywhere, from murals painted on garage doors to string lights strung across porches. Even the HOA meetings had evolved, becoming collaborative forums where residents voiced their opinions openly and worked together to find solutions. Carl, for his part, became known as the HOA officer who listened. He championed initiatives that celebrated diversity and encouraged innovation, ensuring that policies reflected the needs and desires of the community. When disputes arose, he mediated with patience and fairness, always striving to find common ground. His efforts earned him not just respect, but genuine affection from his neighbors. As for Grandpa Thompson, he remained a beloved fixture in the neighborhood, inspiring others with his boundless curiosity and resourcefulness. His electrified fence stood tall, a testament to the power of ingenuity, and a gentle reminder that sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected places. In the end, what started as a clash between two men with differing views blossomed into a story of growth, understanding, and unity. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was stronger because of its imperfections. And though Carl and Grandpa might never have imagined it, their encounter sparked something truly remarkable. A community where everyone felt seen, heard, and valued. On quiet evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the streetlights flickered on, residents would gather outside to share stories and laughter. Among them were Carl and Grandpa, sitting side by side on the porch, swapping tales of old adventures and new dreams. Together, they proved that even the most unlikely friendships could bridge divides, and that sometimes all it took was a little spark to light the way forward.